Now. Okay. Einat, can you see the smile on my face? Because I think I figured it out.
Very good.
It worked? Can you guys see us? Okay, can you, okay, fantastic. Hello, my name is Adam Bellows. I am the CEO and founder of the Israel Innovation Fund, and I wanted to take this time to thank everybody for joining us. And this is our very first webinar. And today we're going to be discussing one of the most timely and important issues as we transition from Yom Hazikaron to Yom Ha'atzmaut. Our speaker tonight is the former member of Knesset, Einat Wilf, Dr. Einat Wilf. Einat is not only an author of a number of different books and articles related to Israel, but has also been on the Israeli political scene for the last 15 years. I've known Einat for about 2.5 years now, and we've gotten to enjoy some wine together on a number of occasions. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. And I think it would be best if I just leave the floor to you now. And
Very well. Thank you, Adam, and thank you for hosting me today. This is a unique opportunity, and this is truly, at this time, at this hour, it's a very special hour in Israel. It is the last few hours of our Memorial Day, Yom Hazikaron, where we remember and acknowledge the fallen. And we transition into 8 p.m. when we begin to mark Yom Ha'atzmaut, our Day of Independence. And what I'd like to discuss today is really the connection between the 2 days and the fact that Israel still today, we're celebrating 72 years of independence, and yet there are still so many who view this independence as provisional, as temporary. And even those who do not, or sometimes those who do not, wonder why there are those who do. And the 2 days are connected. The reason that Israel still today, after 72 years of existence, has to continue to fight for independence, still has soldiers defending it, active conscription, is very much related to the question that celebrating our independence is not a definite final achievement. It is still, in the eyes of many, provisional and something that needs to be defended daily. Now, the way that I've come to this realization and conclusion is something that I detail in a book that just came out. It's a book I wrote with Adi Schwartz. It's called The War of Return. And it looks at the conflict through the very unique perspective of the Israeli War of Independence and the Palestinian refugee issue that came out of it. When I grew up, there was no question in my mind and the political mind of the peace camp to which I belonged, at the time represented by the Labour Party politically, that Israel has a very clear path to peace. That Israel has not only secured its independence, now it can do so in securing peace with its Arab neighbors. And the notion was that Israel has a very clear formula to get to peace. And the formula was famously known as land for peace. Israel will hand over land, which it acquired in the 1967 Six-Day War. We're talking about the Sinai Peninsula in the south, the Golan Heights in the north, and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Israel would hand over this land to its Arab neighbors, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and in return, it could expect to get peace. Because what many people are not aware is that in 1949, at the end of Israel's War of Independence, Israel only signed ceasefire agreements. And it's important, those were ceasefire agreements. None of Israel's Arab neighbors were willing to see the war as being complete. They viewed it merely that they were signing an agreement to cease the fire until the war will continue at some later date. And the later date especially came in 1967. So until 1967, Israel has only ceasefire lines. It doesn't have borders, which many countries did have when they declared independence. So no clear borders, only ceasefire lines. After 1967, Israel hopes, many in Israel hope, that Israel can hand over some of those lands and in return get peace and permanent borders. Now, for a while, this formula seemed to work beautifully. I was one of those kids in first grade. I was living in Jerusalem that they brought out of the elementary schools to wave flags for the motorcade of President Sadat, Anwar Sadat of Egypt, who was coming to speak at the Knesset. Now, today it's hard to imagine how momentous it was, but we're talking about 4 years, only 4 years after the Yom Kippur War, which was the deadliest war Israel had since its War of Independence, truly a terrible war. And only 4 years later, the president of Egypt, Israel's mightiest, strongest enemy, the largest Arab country, he comes to Jerusalem, to the Knesset. He's not making any issues about it. He's speaking in the Knesset, outlines a vision of peace. Israel negotiates, and within 2 years, he gets the entire Sinai Peninsula, twice the size of Israel, no settlements in it, completely cleared, and signs a peace agreement with Israel. More than 40 years later, we can discuss whether what we have with Egypt should properly be called peace. But at the time, that was the deal. We signed a peace agreement, we got a permanent border on our southern border, and we handed over the land. The 1990s, based on this formula, were a decade of euphoria. We were negotiating with the Syrians over the Golan Heights, feeling that peace was at hand. Jordan gave up its claim to the West Bank, and we signed peace with Jordan, determining much of our eastern border. And of course, the key element through the Oslo Accords, we began negotiating with the PLO, with the Palestinians, over the future of the West Bank and Gaza. The feeling at the time was a domino. This is a domino of peace. Bam, bam, one after the other. We are going to have peace according to this formula. We're handing over land, we're getting peace. This was math. This was certainty. And in 2000, this culminates. Ehud Barak, the leader of the Labor Party, of the Israeli peace camp, goes to Camp David, which is very symbolic. Camp David is where we negotiated the earlier peace agreement with Egypt. He goes to Camp David to negotiate with the PLO, with Arafat, an end to the conflict, a peace agreement. And he puts on the table a proposal that was bold. The Palestinians would have an independent state, fully independent, controlling its borders, in the West Bank, in Gaza, with its capital in East Jerusalem. People forget it now, including in the Old City. This was everything we were told that the Palestinians wanted. Ehud Barak was handing over the land and expecting peace. And the Palestinians walk away. Arafat walks away from a clear, concrete opportunity to end the occupation, to have no settlements, to have an independent state for his people in the West Bank and Gaza, and he walks away. This is repeated later in 2008 with Abu Mazen and Ehud Olmert. But not only do Palestinian leaders walk away from these opportunities, what follows, especially after 2000, is a bloody, murderous campaign, which was misnamed the Second Intifada, but really was just massacres in our streets. Anyone who lived through this in Israel will not forget it. Many people on the outside do, but this has shaped our thinking and our politics to the present day. I can tell you that I remember this as the darkest time to live in Israel. There was a sense that if you left your home to meet friends, to sit in a cafe, to go on a bus. You are playing Russian roulette with your life. You might be blown up. You will be dead and not go home. And that was the sense in Israel, that nowhere was safe and that war was everywhere. And these were families, entire families, children massacred in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, in Beersheba, in Jerusalem, literally days after the Palestinians could have had a state. And I and many, many Israelis began to ask, so what's going on? What do the Palestinians want? What is this conflict really about? We thought it was about statehood, borders, settlements, occupation. All of that could have been taken care of, but no. And during that time, I was asked to meet moderate Palestinians. I was working with Shimon Peres, with Yossi Beilin, active in the Labor Party. And in meeting those Palestinians, they told me things like the Jewish people are not a people, you don't have a historical connection to the land, you made it up. And coming back from those meetings, I realized that we had two very, very different conceptions of what we were fighting over, of what this conflict is about. I thought that it was about all the things that relate to land, borders, settlements, occupation, Palestinian state. I realized from their perspective, it was a very different conflict. My people, the Jewish people, were strangers in this land. We were foreigners. We were colonial interlopers. We had no connection to the land, and therefore had no justification for being there. We were not even a people, merely practitioners of a faith who could do it as a minority in other countries. And I realized that from their perspective, their conflict was not about how to divide this land between two legitimate claimants, but about the fact that the Jewish people were not a legitimate claimant at all to any part of the land. And I realized that at this moment in history, more than ever, their claim, the Palestinian claim, is basically is based on this, what they call the right of return, which is neither a right nor a return, but it is their demand to settle millions of Palestinians who have never lived in Israel, and thereby turn Israel into an Arab majority state and erase the whole idea of a sovereign state for the Jewish people. And I realized that they were very serious about it. And this is what led Adi Schwartz, my colleague, and myself to research the topic and to write the book. And we asked a very simple question. How is it that from a war, the Israeli War of Independence, that ended more than 70 years ago, we have today, at the present, millions of Palestinians who claim to be refugees from that war, despite the fact that they were born after the war, despite the fact that they have never lived in Israel. And to make a long story short, and the bottom line of the book is that from the Arab-Palestinian perspective, the war is not over. From their perspective, the War of Independence did not end in 1949. What ended was the battle. A battle was lost to them, but the war was not over. This is, again, why ceasefire lines were established, but not borders. This is why they themselves, the Palestinians, contrary to this myth that they were pawns, they themselves, as agents of history, refused any resettlement, refused any solution that would close the chapter of the War of Independence and establish its outcomes. They wanted to remain in limbo in order to keep alive the idea that the war is not over. And if the war is not over, they do not have to accept defeat, and it could still be won. They could still be victorious. And if they cannot be victorious through military invasions, like it was with the Arab armies, they can be victorious by the implementation of return, by the now very popular idea of a one-state solution, which is again another way of saying no sovereign state for the Jewish people anywhere in any part of the land. So from their perspective, the war is not over. Even after 72 years, it's an open chapter. And this is why today we mark this transition from Yom Hazikaron, Memorial Day, to Yom Ha'atzmaut, Independence Day, because the war is not over. Israel's independence is still, to many, many in the Arab world, in the Islamic world, and certainly to the Palestinians, is provisional. When we meet, Adi and myself have met over the last few years with quite a few diplomats, European diplomats, who represent the countries that underwrite, that fund the organization UNRWA, that keeps alive for the Palestinians the idea that Israel is provisional, that they will one day take over Israel, that Palestine will be from the river to the sea. And we ask them, how can you keep doing that? You are funding an organization that makes sure that the conflict will continue, that there will be no peace, and you are fueling a Palestinian vision that only Palestine should exist from the river to the sea and no sovereign state for the Jewish people. And that's not the official policy of the West. And they always respond by saying, the Palestinians know they're not returning. They don't mean it. I've even invented a word for it. I call it West-plaining, which is like mansplaining. It's when Westerners from their position explain away what Palestinians have just said. Palestinians will say that the right of return is holy, that it must be recognized. And Europeans will say they don't mean it, they know it's not going to happen, they explain it away. And this West-plaining is this neo-colonial attitude that refuses to acknowledge that the Palestinians know what they're doing. They know what they're fighting, and they are agents of history who have a very clear vision, a vision which they repeatedly call out is Palestine from the river to the sea. And I often have to respond to these European diplomats that if you think about the conflict, the Arab-Palestinian side is rational. The notion that the return is a delusion, that they are delusional to think that Israel is temporary. They look at the map. They do a very simple act. They look at the map and they say, what, 7 million Jews living among nearly 500 million Arabs, nearly 1.5 billion Muslims. I mean, to the credit of the Arab world and Islam, they've been very successful in their 7th century conquest. So this is an Arab and Islamic region. And in that region, they see a small, tiny, ethnic, linguistic, national, somewhat religious minority that is different. And they're saying, this experiment of sovereignty for this minority is not going to last much longer. The region will revert to being Arab and Islamic as it has been since the 7th century. So from their perspective, in a kind of long view of history, it's very rational. And once you understand that, you understand also why the war has not ended. What is 70 years in this view of history? From their perspective, why should they sign any agreement that legitimizes the presence of in their view, an illegitimate foreign imperial entity on land that they think is exclusively theirs? Why legitimize it? Why sign any agreement that gives it legitimacy? Let's just wait another generation, another 2, another 5, another 10. But ultimately, this temporary provisional Zionist experiment will be over and the land will be Arab. And this really brings us back to today. We are still fighting to secure our independence, to be recognized with borders on all sides by the entire Arab world and the Palestinians within them, to be recognized not as a foreign crusader imperialist entity, but as the sovereign entity of an indigenous people who belong in this land, who have a long historical connection to it, who are not foreigners. And the only way we can get to this is by continuing to fight and claim our independence and to demonstrate again and again and again that we are going nowhere, that we are not provisional. And only when that truly sinks in over time can then we be hopeful that the Arab world and the Palestinians among them will look at us and say, they're here to stay, they belong, we will not drive them away, not by military invasions, not by terrorist violence, not by return. And now let's see how we live together side by side as independent entities with neither seeking to take over the other. This is the vision of peace that has been the same vision for at least 100 years now. I am still for the long term an optimist, but I believe that to get there, we need to understand that it's going to take time, that we need to be strong, and that ultimately only this way will we get to the point where the world around us, the Arab world, the Palestinians, the Islamic world, looks at us and says, welcome home. Thank you.
Einat, I was talking on mute. I want to say thank you so much. It was an absolutely excellent lecture. And there's a question that comes to mind specifically for me, given what's going on today in the region, and that has to do with Syria. Today, we're dealing with a situation where there's been over, I believe, 8 million Syrian refugees in the last decade. And a conversation that's come up is, why would second, third, and fourth generation Palestinians that are not, originally from what the Palestinian National Movement would refer to as historical Palestine, why would they be receiving refugee funds over first generation Syrian refugees? And I was wondering if you could just comment on how that issue has possibly affected the conversation around the right of return and dealing with Palestinian refugees.
So the refugee situation in Syria only served to highlight the entire mountain of lies and absurdities that has been raised around the issue of the Arab Palestinian refugees. Just to understand the context, throughout the first half of the 20th century, much of the 20th century, certainly from wars in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, many countries were established, decolonization, World War II, establishing of borders. People fled across borders. Tens of millions of people became refugees throughout the 20th century, and they have not remained refugees. And it is not by returning to where they fled from that they ended their refugee status. They just built new lives wherever they were. And that was considered the proper course, to move ahead, to leave the past behind. The Palestinian Arabs were given basically an exemption, that they can still be stuck in the past, unlike any other refugee population. They don't have to move on. They're not expected to settle where they are or to resettle or to build new lives. They are indulged by the West in funding and in UN decisions to keep alive the idea that even into the fifth generation, which is what we're speaking about now, they are still refugees from Palestine. Now, out of 5.5 million refugees who are registered today by UNRWA, about 1 million have been registered in Syria. Now, 500,000. 1 million have been registered in Lebanon and Syria, 500,000 in Syria. We know that a large share of them have long ago left. One of my favorite examples is the multi-millionaire playboy father of the supermodels Gigi and Bella Hadid. He's still on the books of UNRWA in Syria as a refugee from Syria, despite being a citizen of the United States. And no other refugee in the world is a citizen of another country and still on the books as a refugee. So we know many of them have left, but they're still on the books. And ever since the war in Syria, even many more were left that we don't know how many are still in Syria today. And here you begin to see the absurdity. A Syrian refugee who was not previously registered with UNRWA, a citizen of Syria, might escape to Turkey, to Lebanon, to Jordan, get citizenship in Germany. Germany took a lot of them. That person will immediately cease being a refugee once they're settled. And when they're not settled, they will be handled by the Universal International Refugee Agency called the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Their next door neighbor, who is listed on UNRWA's books in Syria as a refugee from Palestine, who might be even better off, have a nicer home. Another great absurdities is that the vast majority of refugees don't live in camps. They lead middle-class lives. They're not different from their neighbors. In Syria, they can work in all professions, leave and travel in and out of the country. For all intents and purposes, they're not refugees. So let's say that same person has escaped the war to Lebanon or to Jordan. Their status as a refugee from Palestine goes with them. So when they go to Lebanon or Jordan, they are still treated by UNRWA. And let's say they do come back to Syria with their neighbor will no longer be considered a refugee. They will continue to be registered as refugees from Palestine. There are now many who have become citizens of Germany. We know Merkel even talked to some of them. And yet they are still on the books of UNRWA as refugees from Palestine. So the situation in Syria only highlights what was already absurd, what was already, to be blunt, a scam. And one of the things that we propose in the book is to stop doing that and to treat refugees from Syria as refugees from Syria, period. If they get new citizenship, they're no longer refugees. If they return to Syria, they're now refugees from Palestine, they're Syrians.
That's absolutely fascinating. And it's, I've always found this situation with the Syrian civil war to be something that's highlighted a lot of the hypocrisies that you highlighted. We have a couple questions from the crowd, but I'd like to ask one more if you're okay with that before I go into the Q&A. The right of return is something that has challenged the Israeli identity for the last 70 years. You talked a lot about the conversations that you had with other Palestinian politicians who feel that our narrative is fabricated, so to speak. And I wanted to know from your point of view, as someone who has been in the Israeli political scene, has done track 2 diplomacy, has been a part of mainstream diplomacy, how do you feel the idea of the right of return has affected not only our own narrative, but also the evolving Israeli identity? And not only that, it also, I'd like you to also touch on maybe even the modern Jewish identity as well, because the last 70 years, you could say, has the first 4 generations of Jews living with another people who are claiming that the ancient Judean homeland doesn't belong to them.
So, first of all, the thing about the Israeli attitude towards the Palestinian demand, the right of return, the demand to settle inside Israel, actually enjoys the broadest Israeli consensus. Politically, across all the Zionist parties, there's no political support, certainly among Jews in Israel, for the idea that the Arabs, the Palestinian Arabs, will get to settle in Israel and make Israel an Arab country. So even if you vote for merit, you do not support that idea. At most, you might engage, and I was part of that too, in what I described as West planing. You might, and I speak to people in the very, very minor kind of Israeli left-wing camp now, who say, no, the right of return is a minor issue, it's solvable, the Palestinians know that they're not returning. So there are still those in Israel who repeat those arguments, but by now they're few and far between. Because in the 1990s, you could credibly make that argument. Because until the 1990s, Israel did not yet, I mean, at least since 1947, put on the table to the Palestinian leadership a clear proposal for a Palestinian state. But once you have such proposals in 2000 and 2008, and Palestinian leaders walk away from them, the argument that the right of return is a bargaining chip that will be bargained away once the Palestinians can have a state loses all credibility with Israelis, because they've had the opportunity to bargain it away, and they've made the exactly opposite choice. They've made the choice to bargain away the state in order to keep fighting away for a return, which is, as you talk, as revelation by action. By their actions, they revealed their true preferences. Better to fight for return than to settle for, in their perspective, a humiliating state, a Palestinian state in part of the land. So for the Israeli political scene, there's no question now. This is the broadest consensus. No one's going to accept this. It's a very, very, very fringe idea. The tough thing for Israelis is to recognize that it is a broad consensus among Palestinians, which puts us at a standstill, because Israelis are united in their opposition, that this is a non-starter. We did not fight, we did not bleed, right? This is what we're marking at this moment, so that at the end of the day, the Jewish people do not have even a single state country that they can call their own. But then on the other side are a people who are resolute in their vision that the Jewish people should not have that state, and that the means to achieve that is through this idea of mass return. It puts us at a stalemate. It is in many ways a bit depressing for those who thought that we had a simple, clear, and mathematical formula for peace: hand over land, get the peace. But it does mean that if we are ever to have peace, this will have to change. So the Arab side or the Palestinian side or the BDS side is trying to change it by getting Jews and Israelis to give up on their Zionism, to say, why do we want a state? No need. Let's support the right of return. Jews can be a minority. It worked so well. Or what we're proposing in the book is that the West and the Arab world mobilize to get the Palestinians to a point where the Palestinians understand that their vision of from the river to the sea does not have Western or Arab support. And then we can hope to have a Palestinian leadership to emerge who will say, okay, you're here to stay, we're here to stay. Now let's figure out where the border should run.
You say that, and the only thing I think of is how much Palestinian leadership needs their Anwar Sadat. It's something that I think that the Palestinians have been robbed of, because good diplomacy has not been something that they've really achieved. If you think about the last 20 years, the Palestinian movement and the national authority, so to speak, the PA or the PNA, however you want to refer to them, has been very unsuccessful in their diplomatic efforts. And I think you highlighted that very well. I would like to go to some of the questions that we have, because I don't think everybody wants to hear what I have to ask you. I can just call you. But I gotta say, Yosef Abramovitz is watching this right now, and he commented that you are without a doubt the smartest of Israel's next generation public intellectuals. You've got a lot of of people saying hello from Nova Scotia, from Tel Aviv, from Miami. So we've got people tuning in all over the world listening to you. And I think that's very, very cool. And I think the topic especially has got to be what interests so many people given today's day. So I just have some questions here. This is from Sarah Morosco. She wants to understand if you're advocating Jabotinsky's Iron Shield. And she'd also like to know if one would like to work in your field, where should they go or how should they begin a career?
So especially someone who grew up in the Labor Party, it was certainly not intuitive for me to think of myself as someone who thinks like Jabotinsky. But certainly over time, I've come to truly appreciate his thinking, his understanding of history, and his respect for the Arabs in the sense of understanding that they were going to be a fierce opposition. I think in retrospect, he underestimated how fierce an opposition they would be. I don't think he thought it would take more than 100 years, and who knows how much more, to build this iron shield or iron wall. But yes, in many ways, I've come to realize that what we're talking about in this book is very much in line with Jabotinsky's thinking that says, and people sometimes forget that on the other side of the Iron Shield, Jabotinsky had a very liberal vision for Israel, because he said, once the Arabs come to term with our permanent indigenous legitimate standing in the region, we can have a very liberal country. And he went very far about to talk about an Arab prime minister and a change between a deputy prime minister, between Jew and Arab. So I am very much, I do identify with that. The notion that we need to be strong, we need to be very clear on the fact that we're indigenous, that we belong here, that we have a history here, that we're not going anywhere, that we're done giving over our fate to others, so that we're not going to be lulled by visions of being a Jewish minority in an Arab state. We're done with that. But we are willing, once our Arab neighbors accept us as legitimate and indigenous and permanent, to be very forthcoming in dividing the land and having a very liberal vision. So yes, I do think the book, by highlighting this issue, is in line with Jabotinsky's thinking. And on kind of career advice, it's not really clear what it is that I'm doing, I must say, what it is, this field. I sometimes joke that I have 3 activities. I think, I write, and I talk. It's only going to work for as long as people want to read and listen. But my major recommendation would be to write. Writing has been very important for me. The books, the essays. Writing is a way of thinking. When you write, you elucidate thoughts, you make arguments. And when you write things, then people also want to hear what you have to say. So for me, this has been the key issue. And the wonderful thing about today's world is that you have many, many outlets to write. You don't have to wait for years before someone will publish you. So you can start writing on your own social media. You can go with a lot of web magazines. And I think that's a great way to start being a person who thinks and writes and talks about the issues they care about.
I love that you brought up Jabotinsky's liberalism, because very few people understand how liberal he was, and how much of, I guess you could say, really his liberal thinking, it definitely gave birth to modern Israel in many respects, given Likud's power over the last 40 years, and how the Likud itself has always been a very socially liberal but fiscally conservative, somewhat political party in Israel. I'm glad that you brought that up, because I don't think that a lot of people are familiar with that. We have a question from Janet Rudman, and it says, it's a little hazy of a question, but it says, what is the best thing that Israel can do if peace is not easily desired by the Palestinian people? So I guess you could sum the question up as, in your opinion, what are the best first steps that Israel can take to push the peace process forward without ceding anything on the negotiation table?
So this is actually a very difficult question to come out of our research. If the Palestinians are indeed so determined to undo Israel, to undo the consequences of the war of 1948, then what can Israel do? I mean, other than offering its own suicide, is there something positive that Israel can do to promote peace? And especially when we talk about Israel putting on the table proposals like in 2000, 2008, having the Palestinians walk away, the question is, okay, so what more can Israel do? This question is the one that dominates our political situation right now. Most Israelis have come to the realization to say, okay, there's nothing concrete for which I can campaign. There's no political party now in Israel, no significant one, that offers land for peace because it's not credible. What are you going to campaign on? What are you going to say? We're going to say, we're going to negotiate with the Palestinians. We're going to hand over land, but we're not sure it's going to lead anywhere. It's not a very compelling political message. So the outcome is that a lot of Israelis say, okay, this is what it is. We'll keep going. We need to be strong. The Israeli Defense Forces is not dismantling itself anytime soon. And I think this is also where most Israelis are. Once we see that there is a real willingness on the other side, we will be flexible as we have been in the past. In fact, there are encouraging signals to come out of especially the Gulf, Saudi, where you're beginning to hear Arab voices that were never heard in the past, who say, what's this thing? Let's end it. Why are we against Israel? Why are we against the Jews in the land? Islam accepts all three scriptures. These are still not the dominant voices in the Arab world. If they were, we would have peace tomorrow. But they are more prominent than they've been before. People writing op-eds, going on TV, they're not being sent to jail when they say that. So that is encouraging. And that says that, who knows, on the days I wake up optimistic, I say this might be sooner rather than later. I do think, though, and this is where I still remain very much an Israeli of the left, is I do think that in the interim, we're not, I don't think it helps us much to continue the settlement project deep within the West Bank. I don't think it sends a good message. I mean, it's true that Israel has built settlements and then took them away. So we know how to do that. We did it in the Sinai, we did it in Gaza, and we did it in northern Samaria. But I think it would be better if we just kind of stopped that and kind of said, look, it might take us another century, but ultimately we understand that there is another people on this land. They're not us. We want to have our own state. They should have their own. The day that they recognize our legitimacy, we're keeping this place ready so that they can have it. This is at least my view, and I think it will send a better message. But still, even if Israel did not have a single settlement, and you could see I'm not a proponent of the settlement enterprise, but I had to acknowledge, certainly working on this book, that even if Israel did not have a single settlement anywhere in the West Bank, there would still not be peace, because from the perspective of the Palestinians, that was never the problem. It's a great scoring point, but it's not the reason they have repeatedly rejected peace, because they could have had a state without settlements in 2000, without settlements in 2008. And of course, they could have had it in 1947 and have celebrated 72 years of independence today with us. But as until the moment, they have chosen to say, better to fight for all of it than to settle for some of it.
You touched on one thing that our next question is going to take us in this certain direction, which is about your opinion about the change in Saudi Arabia. And Vera Gavison would like to know, really, you come off very optimistic, she says. How optimistic are you for peace? Your colleague and my colleague, David Hazoni, and I like to joke all the time in a very serious way that we feel that we're closer to peace now than we ever have been. But Vera would like to know, how do you feel the change in Saudi Arabia's position has influenced the peace process and the idea of peace in the Middle East? And how do you feel that position being changed has affected the other Arab countries as well, both in the Gulf, both monarchies and revolutionary socialist regimes?
So first, hi, Yossi. Hi, Vera. Really good to hear from you via this method. So this is exactly the thing, like you talked about, you and David, that makes me optimistic for a variety of reasons. First of all, the fact that Israel has repeatedly won wars and did not disappear, became stronger, became more prosperous. Then for the last decade, we had the so-called Arab Spring and its consequences. We had the issue of Iran, and you're seeing it in the Gulf countries, in Saudi, that they're beginning to look at Israel and say, Israel is not the problem here. By its handling of the consequences of the Arab Spring, Israel showed itself to be very much a force for stability, one that understands the Middle East, when America not necessarily did. With it standing up to Iran, Israel appears a valuable ally. And the thing about interests is that you can't go to your people and say, well, we have new interests now. You have to also tell a new story. And this is what we're seeing in Saudi and the Gulf. They can't just go to their people and say, up until now, we told you that Jews and Zionists are terrible, but now we have interests and we're going to go with them. What you're seeing is that they're preparing the mindset by beginning to change the story. This is why we're seeing op-eds in Saudi, think tank recommendations, people going on TV in Gulf states, beginning to talk about the presence of Jews in the land as legitimate, as indigenous, as historical, as something that is not against Islam. It's very important for a Gulf person, for a Saudi, when they tell the story of legitimizing Israel, to make it clear that it's compatible with the story of Islam. So we're seeing that. I see the greatest hope in that. For me, sometimes the tragedy, maybe the irony, is that at the moment when the Arab world is beginning to move away from its kind of notion that being Arab means being an anti-Zionist, that the Arab identity is necessarily anti-Zionist, the Arab world is slowly moving away from that. Again, don't pop the champagne bottles yet, but at this moment, many in the West are rushing in to tell the Palestinians, no, keep fighting. These are your rights, and to keep fuel. And in many ways, this is what my book is trying to achieve, to show to the West that we're not getting anywhere closer to peace by indulging this vision. And sometimes I'm actually much more hopeful for the Arabs than I am for the Europeans, because the Arabs actually know what a scam they've been running. Again, to be blunt, when they speak very bluntly about the Palestinian issue. They say, move on, it's enough. They know exactly why they've been keeping it alive. So they're also the ones who are in the best position to pull back and say, enough. This was useful for us for a few decades as kind of the spearhead against the invading imperialists. We no longer think they're invading imperialists. It's no longer useful for us to think that way. So we're ending this kind of racket that we've been running. And sometimes I think there's greater hope there than there is in Europe.
I think it's funny how you were talking about the racket and that we're no longer seen as imperialists. One of my professors I think it was in my master's when I was actually taking it was the first Zionist perspective class on the Palestinian identity I ever took. All of my classes were always taught from the Arab or Palestinian perspective. And he put something into terms that it just clicked in my head how I never realized it. And I thought it was so simply put. He said, the major flaw in the Palestinian national movement in terms of its anti-Zionism and the Arab world at large is that they have always seen Zionism as a colonial imperial movement. And if you truly understand the Zionist movement and Zionist ideology, you would know just because of the sheer ideological force behind Zionism and its followers that it represents and has absolutely nothing similar to any imperial or colonial movements. You mentioning those last few points, that really, I think that really brought that point home. And I think it's fascinating. We have a few more questions. From Fran Jacobs Mayerson would like to know, in a very blunt question, how do we fight US and European propaganda on the left concerning this issue?
So first, it is difficult because that comes with, they've been at it for quite some time. I mean, you can really trace a lot of people on campus today, when they are with their anti-Zionist propaganda, they think they're very original, they're very brave, but you can easily trace the history. You could look at the anti-Zionist propaganda in the Arab world, and again, how it was put together with Nazi propaganda in the 1940s. You can see how it evolves with the Soviet Union, really becomes developed in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And from there, it immigrates slowly to left-wing circles in the West in the 80s and the 90s until the present. It's the same imagery, the same ideas that make anti-Zionism into this unique evil. So for me, the answer to a lot of these things is to expose the roots of it, to expose the history of this propaganda, that it's not emerged because Israel did something bad yesterday. It precedes what Israel does. And it's something that has a long history and uses very certain words and imagery. And I've also tried to introduce a new notion of what it means to be a progressive, to be a left-wing person. And that is, let's agree that to be progressive is to take people at their word, to respect them as agents of history. Because the attitude towards the Palestinians in the West today is a very neo-colonial attitude. It basically does not take them seriously. Because if the Palestinians were to be taken seriously, certainly by the vast majority of the left, they would not have support. Who would want to support a vision that says, get the Jews out, no Israel, no sovereign state, let's leave the Jews defenseless in the midst of an Arab world? Except for a few insane fringe elements, this would not be a vision that would be accepted in the West. But the West takes it in as this story of the oppressed, story of people who are angry, story of people who have no choice, rather than the choice of people who are agents of history. People say, oh, you're blaming the victim, blaming the occupied. No, this is not about blaming. It's about looking straight and saying, look, the Palestinians have told you that if ending the occupation, if the price of it is accepting to share the land with a sovereign Jewish state, they don't want that. So please give them the respect of their actions, of their word, of taking them seriously, that they know what they're fighting for, that they're willing to suffer for what they're fighting for, that their response to Israel is not the result of just some momentary situation. It's a determined long-term vision that says that the Jews have no place being here. And for me, the battle is to expose all that, to show the history. This is why the book, if I'm allowed to say, certainly thanks to my colleague Adi Schwartz, has a lot of historical, serious research that says that this has been determined and serious from the beginning.
You know, I think it's interesting that you ended on the importance of the historical understanding. And I think yes. One of the things that's extremely important, not only about the talk that we're doing now and the day that it is that this is our history. And it kind of leads into another question that I will paraphrase and kind of turn it into my own, but it's from Fram Jacobs Meyerson. And the reason why I brought up that this is our history is because, a lot of people are asking questions concerning points for advocacy. And I've always truly felt that I don't like the word advocacy. I like the word education. And the fact is that the way, in my opinion, you can disagree with this or not, but the way to become the best advocate for Israel or to do Israel advocacy, whether it's online, in person, on campus, or in a coffee shop, is to know who you are and where you come from. And if you're a Jew and a Zionist, that means studying the history and both sides of it for a complete understanding. Would you agree that that would probably be one of the best ways to begin to counter some of the information or the questions or the biases that people are referring to? It really comes down to hitting the books and doing the research to get a very good contextual understanding of this 100-year conflict.
Yes, I think that's critical, especially because once you get the scope of it, you understand what it is. When there was explosions in Gaza, I went to one of the flare-ups a few years ago. I went with my son, who at the time, I don't know, was 6. We were running from TV studio to TV studio, and he wanted to know what this was all about. And I asked him if he thinks he's ready, and he really wants to know. And if so, I'll explain the conflict to him. And I opened the map and I showed the map of partition. And I told him, actually, it's very simple. In the past, when I would speak to groups, I wanted people to think that the conflict is complicated. If they thought it's complicated, it's good enough, they might withhold judgment. But the more I studied it and the more I got into it, the more I realized it's really simple. It's actually not complicated, which is why it was easy for me to explain it to my 6-year-old son. I told him, look, this is the land. The Jews have a historical, legitimate claim to it. The Arabs, too, have a claim to it. The Jews, in order to settle those conflicting claims, have been willing repeatedly to divide the land and to have only part of it. And the Arabs have repeatedly chosen to fight for all of it. And it's not because one side is good and one side is evil. It's because one side is small and one side is big. A lot of people forget that very simple perspective. The Jews are a small minority, which is why they continuously agree to compromise. If we had 1 billion Jews, we probably wouldn't. But we're not. We're a few million Jews. We're cognizant of our situation as a small minority in the region. One of my favorite statistics or numbers to talk about, I say, look, in 1948, Israel declares independence. 72 years ago, there are several 100,000 Jews in the land. Okay, what are we going to do? We're really small. The ratio of Jews to Arabs in the land is 1:50. So what are we going to do? We call Jews to make aliyah, right? To come from all over the world. Great success. More than 3 million Jews arrive in Israel over the next decades. We make a lot of babies, right? Israel is the most fertile OECD country. So lots of babies, lots of aliyah. What's the ratio of Jews to Arabs in the region today? 1:60. So they've been busy too, right? We haven't made a dent in this number. We are, no matter any amount of immigration, any amount of procreation, we are forever destined to remain a tiny Jewish minority in an Arab and Islamic region, which is why we are repeatedly willing to compromise. And the Arabs are not, because they don't see why, being 60 times our numbers, they need to compromise with us in our insane story. So this brings us to this, and to understand that over time, it will take time.
Einat, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. We actually had so many questions that we're not going to be able to get through all of them. I'm so happy how successful this was. And I want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank everybody for watching this our first webinar. It's very exciting. We'll be doing one later today with Gil Troy. And I just want to remind everybody that anyone, if they'd like to support the Israel Innovation Fund, can go to www.wineonthevine.com. and plant a vine in their favorite Israeli winery. And if they even have a favorite cause in Israel that we work with, we can direct some of the proceeds to that cause. I would suggest right now, Leket, the National Food Bank, because there are still lots of people in this country who do not have access to food during the Corona crisis. Einat, I want to thank you so much for joining us. You did an amazing job. I hope that you will continue to do these talks with us some more. And I look forward to seeing you soon.
With great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for being here with us. Take care.
Thank you.